Okay, so hopefully you can still hear us, even though we don't get the background noise. My name's Yvette Warner and I work at the Clinical Excellence Commission, and in the room with me is my colleague Kate Callaghan, who also works at the Clinical Excellence Commission. And today we'll be presenting the first of 3 webinars on the 5x5 Antimicrobial Audit. So what we hope to cover today is to give you a brief background of the audit, go through what's in the audit package, what and how to audit, and how the audit can be used in different settings, which means different kinds of hospitals and facilities. Next week we'll be holding the session on guideline concordance and challenging cases, and the week after we'll be looking at making interventions for the 5x5 antimicrobial audit and providing feedback. And we'll send you the links to the webinars at the end of each week by email. So towards the end of this week you'll get the links for next week's webinar. So if I had to describe the 5x5 antimicrobial audit briefly, what I would say is that this is an audit for quality improvement. So it's very different to comprehensive point prevalence surveys and other methods for capturing antibiotic data that you may or may not be familiar with. And we've got a range of people on the webinar today, so we'll try and hold the webinar assuming that you don't have much background information on antimicrobial stewardship. So the 5x5 audit is a continuous audit intervention and feedback activity, and it captures information on 2 key antimicrobial prescribing indicators. And they are the documented indication or rationale for antimicrobial therapy, and whether the choice of antimicrobial therapy is consistent with guidelines. And we'll talk a bit more about what we mean by that in the future webinar. Auditors are prompted to make interventions to promote best practice prescribing when it's appropriate, and that's essentially when those 2 prescribing indicators aren't met. It's called a 5x5 antimicrobial audit because it requires the collection of data on 5 questions in 5 patients per week on a single ward or an audit location or within a targeted group of patients, and we'll talk a bit more about that as well as we progress. Results of the audit are intended to be fed back to prescribers and other people in the unit or the ward or in your hospital on a regular basis. And the audit, what we found is that the audit is quite sustainable and flexible, and it can usually be incorporated into a healthcare professional's regular clinical duties without too many problems. So to identify 5 patients that are on antimicrobial therapy, review their charts and their notes and answer the questions in the 5x5 antimicrobial audit and record the answers to those questions, it takes about 1 hour a week. So to give you a bit of background, the 5x5 antimicrobial audit is based on an empirical prescribing indicator for hospitals that was developed by the Scottish Antimicrobial Prescribing Group. So they recognise the need to introduce a regular quality improvement indicator in addition to intermittent point prevalence surveys. The indicator has been used in all Scottish NHS networks since 2008 and was part of a multifaceted strategy to address antimicrobial resistance. It was also prompted by increasing rates of Clostridium difficile infection. And on the next slide, I'll give you the references for 2 papers where you can read more about the Scottish National Antimicrobial Stewardship Program. In New South Wales, the introduction of the National Quality and Safety Health Service standards meant that there was a need to develop an antimicrobial stewardship tool that would suit facilities of all sizes, including those in New South Wales without any dedicated AMS resources. We also found that the concept of antimicrobial stewardship was new and a little bit threatening to some prescribers, especially for more restrictive processes, and these processes generally require a bit more staff and a bit more expertise. The 5x5 antimicrobial audit, on the other hand, is about antimicrobial stewardship at a patient level and making interventions at the point of care when antimicrobials are prescribed. It's about empowering teams to be accountable for their antimicrobial prescribing on their own units and be more involved, and it has the potential to be a bit more acceptable. It also sets a minimum standard for prescribing, and we'll come back to that standard as we go through the training. So the 5x5 Antimicrobial Audit was adapted from the Scottish Antimicrobial Prescribing Group tool and pilot tested in 15 New South Wales hospitals over 12 months in 2014 and 15. And what we found over that time was that the indications documented for antimicrobial therapy increased from 87% to 93%, so a small but a steady and sustained increase, and that concordance with guidelines or non-concordance with a documented reason, and we'll talk a bit more about what we mean by that, increased from 74% to 86%. So we were still short of our target, which is 95% or above, but we were well on the way to getting there, and we were really pleased that there was sustained improvement throughout the pilot. We also got qualitative feedback about the audit that was very positive. If you want to read more about the pilot project and how we evaluated it and what the results were, there's a link on your screens to the report which is on our website, and also the references for those two papers about the Scottish Antimicrobial Stewardship Program. And I'll hand over to Kate now.
Okay, hi everyone. I'm going to be talking today mostly about our audit package. This slide actually provides an overview of our core items within that resource package. On the left is a list of the 4 items that were actually PDF documents attached to the webinar invite that you would have received by email. And those 4 documents are the audit user guide, frequently asked questions, the community-acquired pneumonia cheat sheet, and the guide to the data entry and review system. Also within our core items we have what's called Challenging Cases tutorial, which we actually designed as an interactive Microsoft PowerPoint file, and I'll talk about that a little bit later on, and we'll actually go into much more detail in session 2 about that particular tutorial. We also created a database using Microsoft Excel, and we call that the Data Entry and Review System. We actually also have a number of clinician engagement tools and other items to support implementation that we have developed over time as a result of our pilot project that Yvette just talked about. All of these items are available for download at our CLAR webpage. So you go to the CEC website, find the CLAR program, and look for the 5x5 Antimicrobial Audit. So going through the audit user guide, some of you may have a copy of it in front of you, but I'll just go through the basics of what it actually contains. The introduction actually provides information on how the audit methodology actually came about, the evidence behind it, and why the CEC actually chose to develop this particular initiative. The aim of the audit discusses the primary aim of measuring key prescribing indicators, so the 2 that Yvette has already mentioned, and the secondary aim being to prompt point-of-care interventions actually done by those auditors collecting the data, and hopefully the result of those interventions over time improving the results of those key prescribing indicators that we are measuring. The next section is the suitability assessment. And this actually helps to distinguish the extent to which this particular audit activity is likely to provide benefits to your facility or unit, depending on how you're actually planning to use it and what resources you have available to you. So it does raise some pretty important points to your consideration before you actually choose to commit to the project. The method is the longest and most intricate part of the audit user guide, so it covers a little bit about audit preparation before you actually launch the audit, how to sample your patients, and there's some tips on how to ensure that your sampling is actually appropriately randomised. It talks about patient eligibility criteria, which I'll go into in a little bit more detail shortly, and the actual data collection procedure itself. So it covers what data points you actually need to collect and how to make interventions when they're prompted and the like. The next section actually talks about the various limitations of this audit methodology. Although we are big fans of the 5x5 Antimicrobial Audit, it does have some limitations, and it's very important that our auditors and audit coordinators are aware of what those limitations are, especially when you're providing feedback to prescribers. So some examples of some of the limitations that are discussed in that section include the fact that this audit doesn't actually measure the appropriateness of therapy. We're measuring some surrogate markers of appropriateness, such as concordance with guidelines, but we're not actually quoting any statistics around whether or not the therapy was actually appropriate as it was assessed. Another example of a limitation that we've got listed there is that there is always going to be a degree of inter-rater variability depending on different auditors and how they've been trained. So we do this kind of training to try and reduce that variability, but everybody is a little bit different, and that is going to be a limitation of the project. Within the appendices of the Audit User Guide, there's 4 appendices, and each one of those items is something that you are going to need if you proceed with doing the audit. So the first one is quite obvious, that's the data collection tool, where you actually record the answers to the audit questions or the data collection points. The second one is the list of audit definitions, which provides some pretty in-depth definitions for the various terminology that's used in the audit questions. The third item is the eligibility flowchart, and the reason we developed that was even though we do give some clear criteria about which patients are eligible for inclusion in the audit, sometimes this can be a little bit difficult to interpret in practice, and so we've provided a flowchart to help people while they're getting used to actually making those judgments. And then the fourth item in the appendices is the audit coordinator checklist. So we'll be talking about that in our third session when we're talking about how to actually get started. And that audit coordinator checklist provides a lot of advice and guidance around how audit coordinators can best prepare for launching this particular initiative. So in terms of assessing eligibility, there are 3 main criterion that you actually look at when you're determining whether or not patients are eligible for inclusion in the audit. The first one is that the current orders for systemic antimicrobial therapy. And systemic antimicrobial therapy means that it's acting on the whole body rather than being a localised treatment. So we're mostly looking at IV and oral medications and would be excluding therapy that's purely topical. So if it's just something like Chlorsic eye ointment and that's the only antibiotic that the patient's actually receiving, that doesn't actually count as something that we'd be including in the audit. The second point there is that antimicrobial therapy has been prescribed empirically and is not a continuation of stable treatment. So we actually want acute care scenarios. We're not actually looking for patients who have been taking something prophylactically for a chronic condition or for a chronic condition for a very long time. We're looking for an acute infectious cause. And empirically prescribed antibiotics means that at the time of prescribing, the doctor didn't actually know what the causative organism for that infectious condition actually was. And the third point there is that we have it's been fewer than 5 days since the in-hospital identification of the indication for therapy, which is a bit of a mouthful, but basically the reason that rule has come about is we're wanting to look at patients where the guidelines should be used. And so knowing that antibiotic guidelines are actually designed for the initial management of infectious conditions, when you're looking at patients who have been treated already for 5 days, it's not necessarily appropriate to go just by the guidelines. You're probably prescribers are more likely to be making decisions based on how they've responded to their previous treatment and a few other things that actually impact that. So to keep it simple, we thought we would exclude those patients who where it's been more than 5 days since the infectious condition was identified in hospital. On this particular slide, we've got a picture of our flow of the audit questions, and there's also a copy of that on the second page of the Audit User Guide. And you can see when you look at it, generally there's 5 questions, hence 5 by 5, up to 5 questions and 5 patients per week. And we've got 3 questions that actually feed into the indicator results, and that's question 1, 3 and 4. And then the other 2 questions, questions 2 and 5, are actually intervention prompting questions. So to go through them quickly, the first question asks, is there a clearly documented indication for antimicrobial therapy? And you can see there that the percentage of yes answers for that question forms the indicator for indication documentation. Now, if there has been a clearly documented indication, then question 2 is just not applicable and you go straight to question 3. But if there isn't a clearly documented indication, we're actually prompting the auditor with question 2 to seek out to contact the doctor responsible for that patient and actually clarify that indication for therapy. They can choose not to if they have a good reason not to, or they're just not comfortable doing it. So we're not forcing auditors to make interventions, but that's a fairly simple one. It's definitely not unreasonable to ask prescribers why a patient is on antibiotic therapy, and if they actually get a clarified response there, then they can move on to question 3. So question 3 is the choice of antimicrobial therapy concordant with guidelines? And the tricky part about that question is we're just looking at the choice of therapy, so it's actually the antibiotic agents, and we're not specifically looking at dose and frequency and all of those other factors. We're just trying to make sure that they get the drug right in the first place. If the choice of antibiotic therapy is not concordant with guidelines, they actually move on to question 4, which asks, is there a documented reason for non-concordance with guidelines in the notes tab or the electronic medical record? So if the auditor can either find that the choice of therapy matches the guidelines, or they can find that there's a documented reason for not following the guidelines, then that actually contributes to the positive result for indicator 2. If there's no documented reason for diverging from those guidelines, they move on to question 5, which is again another prompting question where they're asked, did you contact the doctor or medical team responsible for the patient with a view to recommending guideline concordant therapy? So again, it's optional as to whether or not the auditor actually does make that intervention. There are some scenarios where it would be very reasonable to decide not to make that intervention. But we do hope that the intervention rates would be quite high, because we hope that is what will contribute to improvements over time.
The host has taken the conference off mute.
Okay, so we'll just stop at that point and just ask whether anyone has any questions about the background information or about those audit questions. And if you're not asking a question, could you please put your phone on mute so we're getting a bit of background noise.
Question number 3 is scan from cough. Is the choice of antimicrobial therapy. You're looking at not specifically first line choice. You know how there's often, first line, second line choice in things like easy and things.
Yes, so if you're looking at your local guidelines, you'll actually have to determine whether or not you actually want to look at the various options. So with the way things are set up in EASY, and for those that are unaware, EASY is an electronic approval system for restricted antibiotics that provides some guideline support as well. So if you set up your local guidelines in EASY, and it's generally accepted to pick either first line or second line options as they're presented in EASY, then that is how you would instruct people to audit at your site. Whereas a lot of people will be auditing as per the therapeutic guidelines, the antibiotic ones, and so if we're referring to those, if it just says, for this particular indication, there's 3 options, it has 1, 2, 3, or list 3 options, but you are actually able to pick any of those, then any of those options would be counting as concordant with guidelines.
Okay, thanks.
Do we have any other questions at this time? Okay, we might move on then, so I'm just going to pop you all back on mute.
The host has placed the conference on mute.
Okay. So I'll just move on to the frequently asked questions document, which you should also have a copy of. This is a very, very useful document. Apart from the audit user guide, which gives you the bones of the audit and how to actually implement it, the frequently asked questions have a lot of extra information on how to actually apply the audit rules in practice. So it does cover most of the common problem scenarios that an auditor might encounter. It helps with interpreting the definitions around what constitutes
clear and specific documentation when you're looking at the indication for therapy or a documented reason for non-concordance. And examples of some of the questions that it covers are things like, is a patient eligible if they've actually just been transferred from another hospital? Or what if I don't actually think that the documented reason for diverting from guidelines is a good enough reason? So it provides advice on how to handle some scenarios like that. And we actually find that we would recommend that all auditors are actually familiar with the frequently asked questions document and have read through it before they start collecting data, because the last thing we would want is for them to collect data for, say, 3 months and then actually have a look at the frequently asked questions and realise that they may not have been making some of the right decisions in the way they interpreted the definitions or applied some of the rules. The next item within the next core item within the audit package is the CAP cheat sheet. So we actually developed this because we recognise that community-acquired pneumonia is a very common diagnosis that our auditors will encounter, but it also can be quite difficult to audit. So, determining the severity of community-acquired pneumonia, if it hasn't been documented by the prescriber themselves, can be quite complicated. And then you're also having to navigate through different types of allergies that the patient might have in order to eventually get to a guideline recommendation on what sort of antibiotics that patient should be receiving. So this cheat sheet actually breaks down that whole process of determining concordance into 3 steps. The first one being assessing the severity, and so that actually provides some assistance with providing the CORG score and the SMART scores, which are a pneumonia severity scoring kind of tools. And it also provides notes about using your clinical judgment, and there are also some points within the guidelines about automatically classifying some patients as severe if they have certain parameters or such as being in ICU. The second step is to actually review the allergies, and we provide some guidance on exactly how to do that. And the third step provides a table to help determine low concordant therapy based on where the patient actually sits. Okay, so I'm going to talk briefly now about the data entry and review system. The pictures that you can see on the slides are actually from our guide document, which is instructions for using the Excel workbook. We actually developed that to help our audit sites collate and review their data themselves. So you've got a lot of control over your own data, and it's not just typing the data in and then doing a lot of complicated formulas or calculations to try and draw it out. A lot of it is actually automated, and you just put your parameters in and it'll give you some statistics and graphs in response. So I'm going to give everybody just a very quick demo because it's a lot easier to understand if you can see it rather than me trying to explain it to you. So I'll go into Excel here. So when you open up, so you download this Excel spreadsheet from our website, and it'll already have some sample data in it that you can actually play with and to see how it works. When you open it up, it opens on the Info tab, and this just provides a summary of where to actually go for the latest version of this file, where you can send some inquiries. So we've got our generic email address there if you're having any troubles with it. And it also tells you what version of this spreadsheet that you're using. Because we envisage that if mistakes are found in the formula, hopefully not, but if we ever have to do some updates to the spreadsheet, at least you can look back and recognise what version you're using and whether or not you need to update it to the next one. So this data entry tab here is going to be where you spend most of your time when you're using this spreadsheet. And this is where you actually collate your raw data. So you take the data collection tools that you have in hard copy and you start entering the information onto this spreadsheet. You can specify up to 3 parameters by which to stratify your data, and you do have to decide that right at the very beginning of your audit project. So here with this sample data set, we've got parameters as hospital, location, and specialty. So this might be a suitable set of parameters if, say, someone is controlling the data for a couple of different hospitals and the audit's being done on a handful of different wards and specialties within those hospitals. And you enter the data from the patient identifier going from left to right. So you've got the patient identifier in this column, which hospital it is, the location and the specialty, because they were the parameters that had been chosen. The date audited, the daily audit number. So for this, sorry, let's scroll up here. Got a lot of sample data in there. So on the 1st to the 3rd, the daily audit number for this audit record was 1 because it was the first patient audited on that date. And then we've got the different the answers to each of the questions there. So the drop-down menus actually change based on what the previous answers to the previous questions were. So it tries to keep the logic of the audit, the skip logic for those questions in order. And then the green tick means that you're not missing any data. If you miss any data, it can interfere with the automatic calculations that are being done. And the OK lets you know that these questions actually, the answers that you've got for that row actually make sense as per the audit rules. So there's a lot of data that's been entered across March and April for a couple of different sites in this sample data set. So we'll have a look at the statistics tab to see how we can process that. So up here we've got the date from and date to. We've just got the dates for the whole of March. And we've obviously got here that we're specifying data by date range and hospital. And so for the whole of March, we've entered the hospital as Prince Hospital. There are 54 audit records, and these are the statistics for those audit records. But if I wanted to change that, say I wanted to actually look at date range and I'll look at date range, hospital and specialty. Now it's actually processing the data for St Hospital for that date range, but just the respiratory specialty patients, and there's only 11 audit records. And I can choose to change that, say, to general medical patients, and all of these data sets all update based on the statistics for what we've typed in there. So we've got 43 audit records, and we now have automatic data, automatic statistics for indicator 1. So it says 79% of audited patients had an indication clearly documented in the notes chart or electronic medical record. And then, indicator 2, 65% of patients received therapy that was either guideline concordant or non-concordant with a documented reason. We've got a few other statistics down here that you can draw on. So how many of the audit records with those parameters were meeting both indicators, how many were meeting neither of the indicators, intervention rates, so how often are we actually making interventions when they're being prompted, and a couple of other things along there. I might also, a little bit of time, show you some of the basic graphs that you can actually bring up using this spreadsheet. And a lot of these are automated as well. You should only be changing things in this top section on this particular tab. So we're looking at both both months of March and April. So we've got the right dates in there. And we're currently specifying the data by date range, hospital, location and specialty. So I'm looking at across March and April, St Hospital records and in the medical A ward, and just looking at general medical patients, and I've chosen to graph those intervals weekly. So down here, these graphs are automatically generated and will adjust based on the parameters that you pick. So you can see here that this is the indicator 1, documentation and antimicrobial indication. This is a run chart that you can just pluck out of Excel and put into some of your reports or put on a slide when you're feeding back to your prescribers. And so it's got quite a few different, so this is the chart for indicator 1, this is your run chart for indicator 2, and then we've got a couple of other charts that are also quite useful as well. But you'll have to go through the spreadsheet and have a bit of an explore there. As you accumulate more data over time, you change the graph intervals and the data points will become much more smooth. So we've just changed it to fortnightly, so there'll be twice as many data points feeding into each of these intervals, and you'll find that it does actually, the trend that should actually smooth out quite a bit. I think that's pretty much all I would have time to show you about this particular spreadsheet, this tool, but the guide document is quite useful, and if you're ever having trouble with it, you can always get in contact with us at the CEC. Okay, so the next item is the Challenging Cases tutorial. So as I mentioned before, it's an interactive tutorial to assist in training auditors, and we'll be going into that in more detail in webinar session 2. Some of the clinician engagement tools that we did develop to support our pilot sites when they were implementing the 5x5 antimicrobial audit, most of them were actually targeted at prescribers and providing information about the actual audit itself. So we developed a template letter, usually to be sent from someone in a position of authority at your facility. So it might be your facility manager, it might be Director of Medical Services or Director of Clinical Governance perhaps. And they send that letter out to prescribers just to let them know what the audit's about and that it will be happening. And you just fill in the blanks for that particular one. There's also a basic presentation, so there's some slides that you could use if you were pitching the audit at a clinician's meeting perhaps. And then there's an information flyer that your auditors can actually carry around with them. So if a doctor says, oh, I actually don't know anything about this particular audit that you've mentioned, you can give them some information there and then and there. And then we also developed some ward posters, which we thought were good reminders to prescribers and other people in the wards that the auditing was actually taking place. And then some of the other items that we developed along the way was actually developed a monthly report template. So this is a template based on the reports that we had developed for our pilot sites when they were undertaking that pilot project. And that template is available again on our website, and people can basically just use the spreadsheet to calculate their statistics and pull their graphs together and then just plot them into that particular template. And fill in the blanks to make it all accurate, and so they can send that out via email to their clinicians and also to other stakeholders within the hospital. We have some practice scenarios to help auditors basically practice their intervention skills, but we'll go into those a bit further in the third webinar session. And as Yvette mentioned before, we also have an evaluation report for our pilot project.
The host has taken the conference off mute.
Okay, so we'll just pause now and see whether anyone has any questions at this point about the tools in the 5x5 antimicrobial audit package or any other questions that you've thought of.
Hello, it's Sandra Wharton from Western, New South Wales. What happens in the smaller sites where you might not have five? Be able to do 5 audits in a month?
It's a very good question, Sandra. We know that we do have a lot of people from small sites on the line. There's quite a bit of interest from some smaller hospitals. So I'll be actually going into that just a little bit later in this presentation. But there is a way that you can do it and still get benefit from the audit. So I'll go into that just a little bit later.
Okay, thanks, Yvette.
Any other questions? Okay, I'll put you all on mute again and we'll just continue on.
The host has placed the conference on mute.
Okay, so with the 5x5 antimicrobial audit, you should get an appreciation of what's involved by now, but it is a fairly simple audit and it is tempting for someone to just pick up the data collection tool and start going for it. And we encourage you to do that, but in order to make it a more sustainable process and something that can be used in the medium to longer term in your facilities, we would recommend setting up a team. And ideally on that team you'd have an audit coordinator or a lead person to coordinate the audit across your facility and 2 or more auditors for each area that you're conducting the audit on. So your audit coordinator would be someone with a strong interest in antimicrobial stewardship or quality use of medicines, has a vested interest in a long-term commitment to seeing through the 5x5 antimicrobial audit and its benefits when it's used over a period of time. The audit coordinator would be someone who trains, supports and provides some direction for auditors, and we expect that they will be someone who would have a more active role during initial implementation of the audit. So that might be selecting which areas of your hospital or your MPS that you perform the audit on, how you'll perform it. It might involve contacting the prescribers and getting them engaged and happy with having the prescribing audited, and it might involve a discussion with the prescribers and with other people in the unit about when it would be ideal to provide feedback and how often and in what formats that feedback should be provided. The audit coordinator would also be responsible for ensuring that data collection is sustained and that the feedback occurs regularly. And we certainly did find in the pilot that it was more effective when that feedback occurred regularly and there were set processes or set times for providing that feedback. On the other hand, your auditors are healthcare professionals, including pharmacists, medical officers, medical students if you have them over a period of time in your unit or in your facility, or registered nurses with an interest in antimicrobials. And ideally, it would be someone that has a clinical role at the audit location and is already used to interacting with prescribers on that particular unit or in that particular area. Auditors should receive basic training, the 5x5 Antimicrobial Audit package, and a copy of any local guidelines that are relevant for determining guideline concordance in that particular ward or in that particular area or in your facility. The auditor would be expected to submit data to the audit coordinator for reporting and feedback, and it's important to clarify what's expected of auditors and offer them support when difficulties arise or when they have any questions or whether they're stuck on particular cases of whether to call something concordant or non-concordant or whether an indication is detailed enough to meet the indicators for question 1.
Okay, so as we've mentioned before, we have a lot of interest in 5x5 Antimicrobial Audit. We've had a lot of people sign up to our webinars and we're very grateful for that interest. But we're also aware that a lot of these people come from very, very different hospitals, and we're also speaking to people from a variety of different clinical disciplines, and then even a few people involved in management as well. So we thought we might give you an overview of how the audit actually, what it would look like in sites of different shapes and sizes and different resource allocations. So in a principal referral hospital or quite a large hospital, we would expect the audit to be as targeted as possible while still getting that 20 patients per month quota. So we'd expect it should be targeted to selected wards or specialties. So you might say, we're going to do some auditing on the respiratory ward, or if you have a lot of respiratory patients that are across different parts of the hospital, sometimes you have specialty wards, but they get quite a mixed profile of patients. You can choose to audit the respiratory patients wherever they are as long as they fall under that specialty, because you would actually be targeting that feedback to the same group of prescribers, even if the patient were on a different ward. And the choice of the specialty or wards that you actually pick could be based on a recognised need. So you might actually be already aware that they're having that they are possibly not performing well in being concordant with guidelines for their antibiotic prescribing, or perhaps they don't write indications down very often, so it might be a recognised need. Or they may actually canvass some of your prescriber groups and see if they themselves are interested, because if they're already engaged and they actually want some feedback about their performance, then that's even better. The auditors at these sites, could be almost anyone. So we're looking at ward pharmacists, members of the AMS team, any interested nursing staff, and you can also work with registrars and junior medical officers and train them up as auditors as well. If it is used in multiple wards or specialties, you can compare and benchmark those results internally, because a bit of competition in those large sites can actually cause performance to improve quite a bit. But you also may need to focus on newly admitted patients, more particularly in these sites, because we did find that with some of our larger principal referral sites that were involved in our pilot project, some of the feedback we got from them was that if they were catching patients and they'd been in hospital for more than 24, perhaps 48 hours, oftentimes the micro results were already available, and so the patient was actually being excluded because they were no longer on empirical therapy. They'd already been changed to directed therapy as per those culture results. So for small to medium-sized hospitals, Again, you should try and target the auditing to a particular ward or specialty if you can get the numbers. But if the numbers are too low to actually record 20 patients per month, you might be able to focus instead on auditing a specific clinical division. So you might say, okay, we're going to audit all medical patients, or we're going to audit all surgical patients, or something similar. You could do both and then compare them. We had a couple of our sort of small to medium-sized hospitals within the pilot choose to do things that way, and that worked out quite well. You could draw on pharmacists and nursing staff probably working together to identify and audit patients across these sites, and perhaps you can also get some help from JMOs. And in quite small units or MPSs that do happen to have some acute beds, this is very likely to be a nursing-led audit process. We recognise that these sites are unlikely to reach 20 patients per month. Maybe they'll be getting 5 patients per month or 10 patients per month. But even though they're not actually reaching that preferred quota, the advantage, if you have a good system in place for capturing all of those patients who are actually eligible, you get to say that your results are accurate for the true population. So you're not actually taking a sample and providing representative data. You get to actually feed that data back and say, even though we only had 8 patients during November, this is completely accurate in terms of how we are treating patients when it comes to acute care antimicrobial therapy. So although only a small amount of data is collected, you might actually find that you could actually contribute that to a larger data pool within your wider district or network. So you could have someone who is coordinating that at a higher level, and they can actually accumulate the data from multiple MPSs or small units across your network, and then pull together some more significant statistics from there. And we would actually say that feedback to prescribers, even though you might not have a lot of data being collected, is still very important. And in particular, you can use cases where certain indicators were missed for local teaching purposes. Okay, so we've just got up on the slide here some information about our AMS Forum presentation. So we had our AMS Forum, our first one in September of last year, and as part of that day we had presentations from some of our pilot sites, some of our people who piloted the 5x5 Antimicrobial Audit last year. And we heard from a representative from Westmead Hospital, which is probably about 1,000 beds. Very large hospital, and then we also heard from Shoalhaven Hospital, which is around 150 beds, and Bathurst Hospital, which is around 110 beds. So we did get to hear from some pilot sites who are quite varied in their resource allocations and the types of patients they treat, and we got to hear about how they actually implemented the audit in practice and what worked well for them, who they used as auditors, whether they found it easy or difficult, what their results were. So we've got the slides for those 3 presentations available on our website now. So if you go to the CHIA website and look for the tab for the AMS Forum, you can find those slides that's there to give you a bit more background information about how this audit has been implemented and used in different sites.
The host has taken the conference off mute.
Okay, so we've reached the end of our prepared presentation, and we've got the remainder of the time for this webinar for questions. So, Sandra, hopefully that answered your question about the small facilities. But did you have any further questions, or does anyone else have any questions for us?
No, it's Sandra. No, that was great. And I think the idea of pooling the data and then looking at the MPS across the board is probably a good idea.
Excellent. Any other questions from people on the line? And no foolish questions? Okay, well, if there's no further questions, just a reminder that our next session will be on determining guideline concordance and working through some challenging cases, and that will be next week, and we'll be sending you the links to the webinars for next week at the end of this week. and then session 3 the week after that. So on behalf of the Clinical Excellence Commission, thank you all for your participation this afternoon. I hope you found this webinar helpful, and we look forward to you dialing in and listening in next week.